Hi, fifth graders. Welcome to our next Friday book tasting. Today we are going to be reading a few chapters from a book called Walk Two Moons, and it is by Sharon Creech. This book falls under the historical fiction genre, so it is fictional. However, it is based on some sort of historical concept or event. Let's take a look at the front cover. What are you noticing? Noticing some mountains in the background. I see what looks to be a woman in the bottom corner, although I'm not quite sure. It could be a man with some long hair. Winner of the 1995 Newbery Medal. Let's take a look at the back. It says, as Sal entertains her grandparents with Phoebe's outrageous story, her own story begins to unfold, the story of a 13-year-old girl whose only wish is to be reunited with her missing mother. In her own award-winning style, Sharon Creech intricately weaves together two tales, one funny, one bittersweet, to create a heartwarming, compelling, and utterly moving story of love, loss, and the complexity of human emotion. All right, so as we see, we have a young girl named Phoebe who is 13 years old, and she is trying to be reunited with her missing mother. So let's take a look inside. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Moccasins are a type of shoe, in case you didn't know that. So saying don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his shoes, essentially. So what could it possibly mean when you say 2 moons, when you've walked 2 moons? Maybe it might mean 2 moon cycles, so the length of 2 moon cycles. Here we have the table of contents. Notice several chapters, they're very short in length, so we're going to read a few. First chapter is called A Face at the Window. Gramps says that I am a country girl at heart, and that is true. I have lived most of my 13 years in Bybanks, Kentucky, which is not much more than a caboodle of houses roosting in a green spot alongside the Ohio River. Just over a year ago, my father plucked me up like a weed and took me and all of our belongings. No, that's not true. He did not bring the chestnut tree, the willow, the maple, the hayloft, or the swimming hole, which all belonged to me. And we drove 300 miles straight north and stopped in front of a house in Euclid, Ohio. No trees, I said. This is where we're going to live? No, my father said. This is Margaret's house. The front door of the house opened and a lady with wild red hair stood there. Already I'm getting the sense that she likes to be around nature. She seems to be pretty upset that there are no trees and that she had to leave all of her trees and nature behind in Kentucky. I looked up and down the street. The houses were all jammed together like a row of birdhouses. In front of each house was a tiny square of grass, and in front of that was a thin gray sidewalk running alongside the gray road. Where's the barn? I asked. The river? The swimming hole? Oh, Sal, my father said. Come on, there's Margaret. He waved to the lady at the door. We have to go back. I forgot something. The lady with the wild red hair opened the door and came out to the porch. In the back of my closet, I said, under the floorboards. I put something there, and I've got to have it. Don't be a goose. Come and see Margaret. I did not want to see Margaret. I stood there, looking around, and that's when I saw the face pressed up against an upstairs window next door. It was a round girl's face, and it looked afraid. I didn't know it then, but that face belonged to Phoebe Winterbottom, a girl who had a powerful imagination, who would become my friend, and who would have many peculiar things happen to her. Not long ago, when I was locked in a car with my grandparents for 6 days, I told them the story of Phoebe. And when I finished telling them, or maybe even as I was telling them, I realized that the story of Phoebe was like the plaster wall in our old house in Bybanks, Kentucky. My father started chipping away at a plaster wall in the living room of our house in Bybanks shortly after my mother left us one April morning. Our house was an old farmhouse that my parents had been restoring room by room. Each night, as he waited to hear from my mother, he chipped away at that wall. On the night that we got the bad news, that she was not returning, he pounded and pounded on that wall with a chisel and a hammer. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he came up to my room. I was not asleep. He led me downstairs and showed me what he had found. Hidden behind the wall was a brick fireplace. The reason that Phoebe's story reminds me of the plaster wall and the hidden fireplace is that beneath Phoebe's story was another one, mine. So somehow these two characters are connected in a way. The Chickabiddy starts a story. Chapter 2. I'm going to try to focus this a little bit more. There we go. It was after all the adventures of Phoebe that my grandparents came up with a plan to drive from Kentucky to Ohio, where they would pick me up, and then the three of us would drive 2,000 miles west to Lewiston, Idaho. This is how I came to be locked in a car with them for nearly a week. It was not a trip that I was eager to take, but it was one that I had to take. Gramps had said, "We'll see the whole ding-dong country." Grandma squeezed my cheeks and said, "This trip will give me a chance to be with my favorite Chickabiddy again." I am, by the way, their only Chickabiddy. My father said that Graham couldn't read maps worth a hill of beans, and that he was grateful that I had agreed to go along and help them find their way. I was only 13, and although I did have a way with maps, it was not really because of that skill that I was going, nor was it to see the whole ding-dong country that Gram and Gramps were going. The real reasons were buried beneath piles and piles of unsaid things. Some of the real reasons were, number 1, Gram and Gramps wanted to see Mama, who was resting peacefully in Lewiston, Idaho. Number 2, Gram and Gramps knew that I wanted to see Mama, but I was afraid to. Number 3, Dad wanted to be alone with the red-haired Margaret Cadaver. He had already seen Mama, and he had not taken me. Also, although this wasn't as important, Dad did not trust Gram and Gramps to behave themselves along the way unless they had me with them. Dad said that if they tried to go on their own, he would save everyone a lot of time and embarrassment by calling the police and having them arrested before they even left the driveway. It might sound a bit extreme for a man to call the police on his own tottery old parents, but when my grandparents got in a car, trouble just naturally followed them like a filly trailing behind a mare. My grandparents, Hiddle, were my favorite parents. So his last name must be Hiddle. My grandparents, Hiddle, were my favorite grandparents, full up to the tops of their heads with goldness and sweetness, and mixed in with all that goodness and sweetness was a large dash of peculiarity. This combination made them interesting to know, but you could never predict what they would do or say. Once it was settled that the three of us would go, the journey took on an alarming, expanding need to hurry that was like a walloping great thundercloud assembling around me. During the week before we left, the sound of the wind was hurry, 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 and at night even the silent darkness whispered rush, rush, rush. I did not think we would ever leave, and yet I did not want to leave. I did not really expect to survive the trip. But I had decided to go, and I would go, and I had to be there by my mama's birthday. This was extremely important. I believed that if there was any chance to bring my mother back home, it would happen on her birthday. If I had said this aloud to my father or to my grandparents, they would have said that I might as well try to catch a fish in the air. So I did not say it aloud, but I believed it. Sometimes I was as ornery and stubborn as an old donkey. My father says I lean on broken weeds and will get a face full of swamp mud one day. When at last Gram and Gramps Hiddle and I set out the first day of the trip, I prayed for the first 30 minutes solid. I prayed that we would not be in an accident. I was terrified of cars and buses. And that we would get there by my mother's birthday, 7 days away, and that we would bring her home. Over and over, I prayed the same thing. I prayed to trees. This was easier than praying directly to God. There was nearly always a tree nearby. As we pulled onto the Ohio Turnpike, which is the flattest, straightest piece of road in God's whole creation, Graham interrupted my prayers. Salamanca, I should explain right off that my real name is Salamanca Tree Hiddle. Salamanca, my parents thought, was the name of the Indian tribe to which my great-great-grandmother belonged. My parents were mistaken. The name of the tribe was Seneca, but since my parents did not discover their error until after I was born, and they were, by then, used to my name, it remained Salamanca. Salamanca. Man, that's a hard name to pronounce. My middle name, Tree, comes from your basic tree, a thing of such beauty to my mother that she made it part of my name. She wanted to be more specific and use Sugar Maple Tree, her very favorite, but Salamanca Sugar Maple Tree Hiddle was a bit much even for her. My mother used to call me Salamanca, But after she left, only my grandparents Hiddle called me Salamanca, when they were not calling me Chickabiddy. To most other people I was Sal, and to a few boys who thought they were especially amusing, I was Salamander. In the car, as we started our long journey to Lewiston, Idaho, my grandmother Hiddle said, "Salamanca, why don't you entertain us?" "What sort of thing did you have in mind?" Gramps said, "How about a story? Spin us a yarn." I certainly do know heaps of stories, but I learned most of them from Gramps. Gramps suggested I tell one about my mother. That I could not do. I had just reached the point where I could stop thinking about her every minute of every day. Gramps said, "Well then, what about your friends? You got any tales to tell about them?" Instantly, Phoebe Winterbottom came to mind. There was certainly a hog's belly full of things to tell about her. I could tell you an extensively strange story, I warned. "Oh, good," Gramps said. "Delicious." And that is how I happened to suspend my tree prayers and tell them about Phoebe Winterbottom, her disappointing mother, and the lunatic. Let's see, do we have time for one more? How many pages are left? All right, let's start, and we might not finish, but we'll see where it takes us. Chapter 3, Bravery. Because I first saw Phoebe on the day my father and I moved to Euclid, I began my story of Phoebe with the visit to the red-headed Margaret Cadavers, where I also met Mrs. Partridge, her elderly mother. Margaret nearly fell over herself being nice to me. "What lovely hair," she said, "and aren't you sweet?" I was not sweet that day. I was being particularly ornery. I wouldn't sit down and look at Margaret. As we were leaving, Margaret whispered to my father, "John, have you told her yet how we met?" My father looked uncomfortable. "No," he said, "I tried, but she doesn't want to know." Now that was the truth, absolutely. Who cares, I thought. Who cares about how he met Margaret Cadaver? So I'm picking up that Margaret must be her father's new, it sounds like she's his girlfriend, and she's pretty upset about this. So let's keep reading. When at last we left Mrs. Cadaver's and Mrs. Partridge, we drove for approximately 3 minutes. 2 blocks from Margaret Cadaver's was the place where my father and I were now going to live. Tiny squirt trees, little birdhouses in a row, and one of those birdhouses was ours. No swimming hole, no barn, no cows, no chickens, no pigs. Instead, a little white house with a miniature patch of green grass in front of it. It wasn't enough grass to keep a cow alive for 5 minutes. "Let's take a tour," my father said, rather too heartily. We walked through the tiny living room into the miniature kitchen and upstairs into my father's pint-sized bedroom and on into my pocket-sized bedroom and into the wee bathroom. I looked out the upstairs window down into the backyard. Half of the tiny yard was a cement patio, and the other half was another patch of grass that our imaginary cow would devour in 2 bites. There was a tall wooden fence all around the yard, and to the left and to the right of our yard were other identical fenced plots. After the moving van arrived and 2 men crammed our Bybanks furniture into our birdhouse, my father and I inched into the living room, crawling over sofas and chairs and tables and boxes and boxes and boxes. My father said, "It looks as if we tried to squeeze all the animals into the chicken coop." 3 days later, I started school and saw Phoebe again. She was in my class. Most of the kids in my school spoke in quick, sharp bursts and dressed in stiff new clothes and wore braces on their teeth. Most girls wore their hair in exactly the same way, in a shoulder-length bob, that's what they called it, with long bangs that they repeatedly shook out of their eyes. We once had a horse who did that. Everybody kept touching my hair. "Don't you ever cut it?" they said. "Can you sit on it? How do you wash it? Is it naturally black like that? Do you use conditioner?" I couldn't tell if they liked my hair or if they thought I looked like a wangdoodle. One girl, Mary Lou Finney, said the most peculiar things, like out of the blue she would say, "Omnipotent," or "beef brain." I couldn't make any sense out of it. There were Megan and Christy, who jumped up and down like parched peas, Moody Beth Ann, and pink-cheeked Alex. There was Ben, who drew cartoons all day long, and a peculiar English teacher named Mr. Berkway. And then there was Phoebe Winterbottom. Ben called her Freebie Icebottom and drew a picture of a bumblebee with an ice cube on its bottom. Phoebe tore it up. Phoebe was a quiet girl who stayed mostly by herself. She had a pleasant round face and huge, enormous sky-blue eyes. Around this pleasant round face, her hair, as yellow as a crow's foot, curled into short ringlets. During that first week, when my father and I were at Margaret's, we ate dinner there 3 times a week. I saw Phoebe's face twice more at her window. Once I waved at her, but she didn't seem to notice, and at school she never mentioned that she had seen me. Then one day at lunch she slid into the seat next to me and said, "Sal, you're so courageous. You're ever so brave." To tell the truth, I was surprised. You could have knocked me over with a chicken feather. Me? I'm not brave, I said.